Usually, when a person loses someone special, their attachment to them fades over time. But for me, after I lost Annie, I had the opposite reaction. Having quickly gone from visiting her grave once a week, to twice, to 4 times, to every day. I knew it wasn't healthy. I knew it wasn't right. But the more I thought about her out there on her own, I just couldn't bear to leave her alone. So I somehow managed to land a job at the graveyard itself, working the literal graveyard shift as a night watchman, which afforded me the opportunity of being close to Annie's grave, at least half a day every day. Truth is, if I could have worked around the clock just to be close to her at all times, I would have. But I had to eat, and had to sleep. And also, they just wouldn't let me. So when I wasn't patrolling the graveyard premises or taking a piss break, I made the most of the time I did get with her, telling her jokes and stories, reading her books, and bitching about how the world's gone to shit, just like I used to do. And for a while, all was right again. One could call it obsessive, or delusional, or just plain sad. But for me, it was a weird return to normalcy, like I had somehow found a hack, a way to keep our relationship going long after Annie was gone. That is, until those fuckers ruined everything. The thing about my town's graveyard was, despite the fact it was very small, and in the middle of the wilderness, one of its graves, that of a rich oil tycoon buried there over 100 years prior, had been known to attract, I guess what one could call, unsavory characters. Grave robbers who sought to unearth an artifact, a pendant to be precise, rumored to be extremely valuable, and at the same time, extremely cursed. And as the graveyard night watchman, it was my sole responsibility to protect the cemetery, its graves, and the oil tycoon's treasure from said grave robbers. For the first few months of my tenure, I had encountered 4 attempts at plundering the oil tycoon's burial site and had successfully stopped all 4, each time discovering that the grave robbers were just mischievous teens. But the 5th time, well, the 5th time didn't go as smoothly. It was a summer's night in July of 2019, when, after patrolling the cemetery grounds and stopping at my wife's grave to say hello, just as I always did, I saw flashlights approaching. Not again, I thought to myself, realizing that the lights were coming from the oil tycoon's gravesite, and assuming that it was another group of mischievous teens. But when the lights grew closer, I spotted 3 haggard men, one quite tall and ogreish, one short and bald, and the third of average height with a long gray beard, each carrying shovels, as they bickered with one another. That is, until they saw me. Well, look what we got here. If it ain't the local law enforcement, the short man joked, causing the other 2 to break out into laughter. That I said, as I stepped out from my wife's grave and into the path, blocking them from their escape route. I'm gonna ask that you kindly step aside. I'm afraid I can't do that. Well, then I'm afraid you're gonna end up like the others in here. Listen, pal, just do as my friend said. Step aside, and no harm will be done to you, the bearded man, and presumably the leader, threatened. Suddenly I saw something glimmer. It was the oil tycoon's pendant, dangling from his shirt pocket. Sorry, pal. Return the pendant, and no harm will be done to you. Suddenly, they all broke out into laughter before the ogreish man came running over, knocked me down, and pinned me to the ground. Then they all charged at me and began pummeling me over and over until I nearly passed out. That's when I heard the short man stop, as if realizing something. Wait a minute, remember when we were staking out the place? How this guy's always hanging around the grave. Why do you think that is? I heard him ask, my ears ringing from the pain. The bearded man crouched down, reached into my pocket, removed my wallet, and then my ID. He looked at my license, then over at the grave. It's because he's related to them. Which means it's only right that we make one more stop on the way out, he explained, before walking over to my wife's grave, lifting up his shovel, striking it into the dirt, and breaking ground. "No," I mumbled, unable to get up, as I proceeded to watch the 3 grave robbers unearth my wife's casket and open it. Then the bearded man removed the necklace from her body and placed it in his pocket, along with the pendant. "And now for you," he said, as he walked back over with his shovel. Within a matter of 15 minutes, they had dug out a new shallow grave beside that of my wife and tossed me into it before covering it with dirt and burying me alive. For a while there was just darkness. I struggled and struggled for what felt like an eternity. Until I finally felt my hand penetrate the dirt and touch the cold night air before moving it to the ground for leverage and using it to push my head through the dirt. Gasp. Before pulling out the rest of my body. I laid there, bloody, dirt-covered and hyperventilating, terrified of what had just occurred. But I hadn't even seen the worst of what was yet to come. I gathered all my energy and sat up, looking over to see my wife's unearthed casket. But when I looked inside it, her corpse was gone. I collapsed back to the ground, wondering why the grave robbers would have taken my wife's body as well. Those sick fucks. Lying there, staring up at the stars and trying to make sense of what happened, I suddenly heard someone approaching. I sat up again, this time to find a man hobbling over to me, his face corroded, his skin rotting, and his arms extended as he growled away. What the fuck? I thought to myself before hopping up from the ground and looking around. That's when I saw the very shovel that the grave robbers had used to bury me alive, just lying there in the dirt. I picked it up just as the creature had charged over to me, its dirt-filled claws swinging in the air. But before it could strike, I swung the shovel and decapitated the terrifying monster, sending its head rolling off into the grass. Shocked by the series of events that had just unfolded, I ran as fast as I could in the direction of the cemetery gate. But as I passed the other graves, I couldn't help but notice that every one of them had been unearthed. Now, I would have suspected that the grave robbers had dug them all up, but not enough time had passed for that to be possible, and after thinking about the creature I had just encountered, it suddenly all became clear. The curse. I thought to myself, remember the legend about the oil tycoon's artifact? The grave robbers had the pendant. They've awakened the cemetery's dead, and now they're all out there, including my wife. Annie. I thought to myself, my mind finally returning to her after processing what had happened. She's out there somewhere. But before I could dwell on the thought too long, a horde of about 4 other creatures came hobbling up behind me, growling and gnawing their teeth in the air. I had no other choice but to run, fleeing the graveyard and heading into the forest that surrounded it. I thought about my options for a moment. Risk death to seek out my wife's undead corpse, or let it go and get the fuck out of there. But once again, I couldn't bear to think about my wife out there, on her own, no matter what condition she was in. And so, I set off, further into the woods, listening for any sound of movement or crunching underbrush in the forest. Eventually, I caught up to a group of about 5 undead, who all came charging at me at once. I swung my shovel with all my might, back and forth, hacking off their arms, legs, and heads, until only one remained. My wife. Standing there, surrounded by a pile of body parts, was Annie. But at the same time, not Annie. Instead, her face had peeled away, leaving nothing but bone and rotting flesh, her body falling apart. Simultaneously, a tear ran down my eye and my body began to shake in horror. This wasn't the woman I married, I thought to myself. She too began hobbling over to me, but didn't attack. Instead, her teeth grinded and I heard her growling. But rather than do what I did to the others, I decided to leave her in one piece, leading her back to my car and pushing her undead corpse into the trunk, intending to return her to her grave. But how? If all of the dead are awake, I thought to myself before seeing another horde of corpses walking off down the old dirt road, all in the same direction. Where are they going? I wondered as I slowly followed behind them in my car. Sure enough, not far down the road, I saw the 3 grave robbers stepping out of their truck and entering one of my small town's sleepy taverns. The artifact. I thought to myself, realizing that the creatures were being drawn to the very item that had awakened them from the dead. They must be after it. I peeled off, driving over the undead that I had followed down the road, their bodies crunching under my car, as I sped over to the bar. On my way there, I couldn't help but hear my wife's growling coming from the trunk. "Don't worry, you'll be back to sleep soon," I comforted her, just as I had always done by her grave. I entered the bar to find it empty, save for a single bartender and 3 patrons, the 3 grave robbers themselves having each nearly already slurped down their pints. "Give me the pendant," I demanded, causing them all to turn around. "You again," the short man replied. I said, "Give me the pendant," I repeated, unveiling the shovel. "Listen, kid, we're sorry, all right," the bearded man began. "Just be thankful you made it out alive. Now just forget about it and walk away. Even with the shovel, you're not going to get the revenge you're looking for." "That isn't why I'm here." "It isn't? Then what are you here for?" the short man asked. "The artifact that you stole from the oil tycoon's grave. It's long been cursed, and you just awoke the cemetery's dead." "Like undead?" the leader asked. "I'm afraid so," I answered genuinely. "And they're all about to descend on this very bar." For a moment, they all gasped before pausing, and then, in unison, bursting out into laughter. "You're trying to tell me that we awoke the dead by stealing the pendant, and now they're all outside, about to bust into here and kill us all?" the short man asked. "Yes, that is exactly what I'm telling you," I said, growing nervous that the creatures could enter at any moment as my body began to shake. "You know what, kid? I really didn't like you back at the graveyard, but maybe you ain't so bad. That's a funny one," the leader said. "It isn't a joke," I insisted. That's when the bearded man grew tired of the conversation, hopped off his stool, and started walking over to me. "Say it one more time. Tell me it ain't a joke one more time, and I'll put you back in the ground again." Just then, as he continued to close in on me, I saw 2 creatures enter the bar and walk up behind his friends, who had turned back to the bar. "Behind you. There are," I tried to warn the leader, but he was much too focused on teaching me what he must have thought was some sort of a lesson, and struck me to the ground. "Shut up," he screamed. I wiped the blood from my lip. "Mister, you're making a mistake. You really need to turn around." He struck me again. "I told you to shut up." That's when I saw the undead creatures proceed to attack his 2 friends. But this time, I said nothing. I just watched on, as blood continued to drip from my face, and the sound of his friends screaming rang out through the bar. "What the fuck are you 2 idiots howling on about?" the leader asked, as he turned around to find his 2 friends being torn to pieces and devoured by the undead, who had now tripled in number and were heading towards us both. "What the fuck?" he cried out, looking back at me, as he must have now realized that I had been telling the truth all along. But that's not possible. That's when I saw it again, shimmering in the light, the pendant dangling from the bearded man's pocket, along with my wife's necklace. Suddenly, the creatures charged at him, and in the chaos, I seized the opportunity to reach out and snatch both items from his shirt before running off to the back of the bar. I looked back to see what happened to the leader of the grave robbers, but had turned a corner and could only hear him scream. I then smashed open a window with my shovel and jumped out, running for the parking lot and hopping into my car, where I peeled off, still terrified, as I continued to run over creature after creature, on my way down the dark forested street, back towards the graveyard. Once again, I could hear my wife growling in the trunk. "Don't worry, Annie, we're almost there." When I got back to the cemetery, I freed my wife from the trunk of my car and led her to the gravesite of the oil tycoon, where I did my best to tie her to a nearby tree, knowing that as soon as I returned the artifact to its rightful home, I'd have to bring her back to her own. But after dropping the pendant back into the oil tycoon's grave and beginning to shovel dirt back onto it, I heard a familiar voice call out from behind me. I can't let you do that." I turned around to find the leader of the grave robbers, alive and well, having clearly escaped the creatures at the bar, and followed me back to the graveyard, now aiming a shotgun at me. "Give me the pendant, and I promise I'll walk away and leave you alone." Looking at the barrel of his gun and shaking in fear, I realized that I had no choice, and did as he asked, reaching my hand into the dirt and removing the very artifact that had gotten us into the mess in the first place. I tossed it to him. He began to walk away, but then suddenly he stopped and turned back around. "You really thought I was just going to walk away like that before killing you," he said, as he moved closer and put the gun to my head, my back to the oil tycoon's grave. "You meddling idiot." I closed my eyes and waited to hear the sound of him cocking the gun. But he never did. Instead, all I heard were the sounds of growling, screaming, and clawing. I opened my eyes to find my undead wife standing there, gnawing away at the man's jugular, as he looked at me, unable to speak, his only expression, that of confusion, as his last thought must have been how he had gone from hunter to hunted. After Annie was done with the bearded man, she let him go, his corpse dropping to the ground with a thud. And as he lay there, his arm outstretched, I saw the artifact dangling from his fingers. Once again, I took the pendant from him and once again tossed it back into the oil tycoon's grave before covering it with dirt and restoring the burial site. "Let's hope this works," I said to my wife, who was just standing there, looking at me. I then began to lead her back to her own grave. But before we made it halfway there, her body collapsed, clearly a result of the artifact being returned and the curse having been lifted. I placed her necklace back around her neck. After returning my wife to her coffin and burying her for the second time in my life, I whispered my goodbyes to her gravestone, just as I had always done, before heading off back into the woods. I spent the better part of the rest of the night hunting down all of the fallen creatures, who had all collapsed when the artifact had been returned to the oil tycoon's grave and the curse had been lifted. Eventually, I made my way back to the bar, where I found the two other grave robbers dead and the bartender alive, cowering in the corner. "Let's just keep this between us, huh, Frank," I said, having known him for years, after spending a good amount of my youth at that very bar. Frank tried to reply, but he was still too shocked to utter any words, simply nodding, his hands trembling in fear. And so, over the course of the night, I kept returning to the graveyard, reburying each and every one, or the fallen creatures, and digging 3 new graves. ... 1 for each of the 3 grave robbers who had buried me alive, desecrated my wife's grave, and awakened my cemetery's dead. I wish I could say that after that I was able to go back to the way things were, keeping my night watchman job and spending hours on end by my wife's final resting place. But after seeing what had become of her, it had finally become clear to me that she was no longer the Annie that I once knew and loved. No, that Annie had gone, long ago, when she passed away 5 years prior. So I quit the graveyard night watchman job, never to return. Until I do tomorrow, on the 10th anniversary of her passing, and nearly 5 years since my last visit. And when I do, I plan to retell her the story of the grave robbers and how those 3 extra corpses ended up in the graveyard. Still to this day, when I go to bed at night, the image of the cemetery's dead still haunt me. I just hope that if anyone stumbles onto a small graveyard in the middle of the wilderness with 3 unmarked graves, where an oil tycoon is buried, they don't go digging for his treasure.